The contrast today is just staggering. Apparently, when a Republican is convicted, it's weaponization. But when a Democrat is convicted, the president's son no less, that's justice. I mean, give me a break. Do Republicans still believe that President Biden is weaponizing the justice system? Because if he is, he's sure doing a lousy job. And as usual, the only Trump derangement syndrome going on around here is on the other side of the aisle. I mean, people are saying that Biden orchestrated the conviction of his own son in order to justify the criminal charges against Trump. That is how you think when you are in a cult.
That is how you think when you're in a cult. And, you know, we hear about situational ethics. In the case of Republicans, it's situational patriotism.
That's right.
They love the Justice Department when their opponents are being prosecuted. They love American democracy when their candidates win. Mm-hmm. But if they lose elections, suddenly they hate American democracy and they think it's corrupt. If Donald Trump is convicted of crimes, of felonies, 34 times, suddenly they hate the justice system. But, you know, if it goes the other way for them, all right, situationally, they're okay.
So what is it,
it's
Willie?
Such hypocrisy.
Is it Biden's Justice Department being weaponized by Biden, or is it not?
Yeah, I mean, this lays bare everything that we've been saying on the show for many, many years now about the hypocrisy. I mean, when you look at the disappointment, frankly, from many Republicans about the outcome of this trial, they wanted to be able to say that there is a two-tiered system of justice, that the Justice Department is out to get Joe Biden, when in fact this jury came back very swiftly, by the way, with a conviction on 3 counts against the son of the President of the United States. And consider the different responses from these two men.
Yeah.
After Donald Trump was convicted of 34 felony counts, he went crazy. Of course, his supporters went crazy. They're coming after him. Joe Biden personally sent his goons to send Donald Trump to jail, on and on and on. The system is rigged. You had prominent United States senators saying we're like Cuba now, that the jury system is broken, that we're a third world country. Yesterday, President Biden put out a statement after his own son was convicted and may go to jail, saying, my son, I'm proud of my son. I don't like the outcome here, but I respect the outcome, and we'll work through this as a family. There is the difference.
There it is.
And what a stark difference in every way. In every way. You go back to 2000 when Al Gore had every right to be angry at the outcome of the election. And what did you have Al Gore doing?
Beautifully
conceding. You can go back to 1960 and the Nixon folks. They knew in their mind that Illinois had been stolen. Richard Nixon decided in 1960 he wasn't going to tear America apart. He was going to accept the outcome. Now, of course, Pat Buchanan, when we asked him, Willie, why didn't you complain more about Illinois? Because historians say that it looks like Kennedy stole Illinois. He said, because we stole Kentucky, Joe.
Oh, my God.
So maybe there were some shenanigans going on there. But the bigger point is that after the election, after these deeply personal fights where people and families give everything they have, these politicians in the past have become statesmen. Mm-hmm. Al Gore's finest moment. I mean, if you look through his career, I was just blown away by his concession speech.
Yeah.
It was extraordinarily moving and said what a lot of people said. If that guy had run, if we had seen more of that, he would have won the election in 2000. But here, it's all situational with Trump supporters and, unfortunately, a contaminated Republican Party, especially in the House. If Trump wins elections, then democracy's fine. If Trump loses elections, then American democracy is broken. If Trump is convicted, then the rule of law is corrupted, and we're no better than Castro's Cuba. If Hunter Biden is convicted, well, yeah, the way the justice system works.
Most people with basic values know that's wrong. Also, and we begin with what comes next for Hunter Biden. After a jury yesterday found him guilty on all 3 felony charges on his federal gun trial. The president's son had pleaded not guilty to the 3 counts tied to lying on a federal gun application about his drug use. Sources inside the defense room tell NBC News that following the verdict, Hunter Biden thanked everyone there by name, hugged them, and tried to raise their spirits. He later issued this public statement, quote, "I am more grateful today for the love and support I experienced this last week from Melissa, my family, my friends, and my community than I am disappointed by the outcome. The recovery is possible by the grace of God, and I am blessed to experience that gift one day at a time." Special counsel David Weiss spoke briefly to reporters following the verdict.
No one in this country is above the law. Everyone must be accountable for their actions, even this defendant. However, Hunter Biden should be no more accountable than any other citizen convicted of this same conduct. The prosecution has been and will continue to be committed to this principle and to the principles of federal prosecution in carrying out its responsibilities.
Hunter Biden and his attorney have said they plan to appeal this verdict. As I mentioned, President Biden issued a statement reacting to the verdict in his son's gun trial. It reads in part, "I will accept the outcome of this case and will continue to respect the judicial process as Hunter considers an appeal. Jill and I will always be there for Hunter and the rest of our family with our love and support. Nothing will ever change that," end quote. Last week, the president said very clearly he will not pardon his son. President Biden also had an emotional reunion with Hunter late yesterday. The two hugged on the tarmac after the president changed his schedule and flew to Delaware following an event in Washington, Joe.
Yeah, I just wonder. The prosecutor said that Hunter Biden shouldn't be treated differently than anybody else. So why was he? Because he was. If his last name was Smith, these charges would have never been brought. If his last name was Jones, they would have never blown up the plea deal that they already had done, that the judge respected. I mean, you know, again, I'm a big believer. It went to the jury, and I believe in the system. And we'll always believe in the system. But he doesn't need to come out and lie and say that Hunter Biden's being treated like everybody else, because Hunter Biden is there because of his last name. End of story. And a lot of Trump people could say the same thing about what happened in Manhattan with Alvin Bragg. But in this case, Biden was there because of his last name and nothing else.
And by the way, some Republicans have said the same, Joe. Senator Lindsey Graham said that last week. You even had some very pro-Trump Republican members of Congress, again, as I said, disappointed, I think, by this outcome because they wanted to show a two-tiered system of justice, saying that this trial had always been kind of silly, that it was a distraction from more serious things to look at with Hunter Biden. They're saying that now after the fact. Let's bring in former litigator and MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin. Lisa, good morning. What's your reaction to the verdict in Delaware?
My reaction, Willie, is that this is the paradigmatic both-and situation. What I mean by that is you can find that the jury's conviction here is just that Hunter Biden knowingly possessed and applied for a firearm, understanding that he had been an addict and that addiction is a continuing state, that it doesn't stop and start, but rather once an addict, always an addict. And at the same time, as Joe said, you can not only find this situation to be totally tragic, but believe that it never should have happened in the first place, that the plea deal that was engineered between the U.S. Attorney's Office and between Hunter Biden's then lawyers was one that should have been honored. And it fell apart principally for two reasons. It fell apart first because the prosecutors wouldn't commit themselves to saying that the plea deal fully resolved all possible investigations against Hunter Biden, including those under the Foreign Agent Registration Act stemming from his work in Ukraine. But the other reason it fell apart is because the judge who oversaw this trial, Mary Ellen Noreika, bristled at the idea that she should have to supervise the question of whether Hunter would be in compliance with the diversion agreement that was set up to handle the gun charges. And the reason that that deal was struck in the way that it was is an unspoken reason, and I'll tell you what it is. It's because the prosecutors here and Hunter Biden's lawyers feared that because the diversion agreement was 2 years in duration, in a possible future Department of Justice controlled by Trump and or another Republican who was retributive against Hunter Biden, that person would have an excuse to say Hunter Biden was out of compliance, that he deserved to be thrown in prison. They didn't want a future Republican DOJ to have control over that decision. And therefore, in the plea agreement, they engineered it so that the judge would oversee that determination. When they presented the plea deal to her last July, she said, why should I be in control of that? That's not my decision to make. But what she didn't understand and what no one could say to her on the record is we're doing it this way because we fear retribution against Mr. Biden if it's not set up this way, Your Honor.
Lisa, could you speak to the jury what happened yesterday, a jury trial? The son of the President of the United States of America is on trial in Delaware. His neighbors, Delaware residents, are sitting in judgment of him. 12 ordinary people, citizens, sitting in on judgment on the son of the president. The president doesn't interfere in this case.
No.
The president announces that he will not pardon his son. Hunter knows that he lied on the application. That's why he's there. At the end of the day, do you think ordinary Americans give enough thought to how this system is a miracle, a gift to this country, a gift to democracy, the jury system, and the way it works? It worked in New York, and it worked in Wilmington.
And most of the time, Mike, it does work. I wish they would give more thought to the miracle that is our jury system. It's endemic to the democracy that many of us believe is teetering on the brink right now. This is a testament to what is unshakable about our democracy. I was really struck by the 3 jurors who came forward yesterday and talked to members of the media, and one in particular who essentially said to our Katie Tur yesterday, look, I think this case should have been prosecuted. I believe the charges should have been brought. I believe he was guilty of those charges. And yet, I believe jail time here is entirely inappropriate because not only of how the charges came about, but because of some of the underlying facts here. This is a person who has brought his life around. He's married. He has a young son. He's earning a living. And the circumstances that led to the charges in the first place. Let's remember, Hunter Biden owned a gun for 11 days. And the reason that the gun was ever recovered in the first place was because his sister-in-law, Hallie Biden, with whom he had been romantically involved, was so fearful that he might use the gun to harm himself that unthinkingly she took the gun and deposited it in a trash can outside a Wilmington grocer. That struck a chord with that particular juror. And again, paradigmatic both-and situation. I believe this case should have been brought. I believe he was guilty of it, and yet I can see it as the tragedy that it is.
So President Biden learned of the verdict while he was at the White House preparing for, ironically enough, a speech on gun safety. He then changed plans, made an unscheduled trip back to Wilmington, Delaware. He embraced his son on the tarmac. As you see there, the family spent last night in Wilmington, and then the president will fly this morning to Italy and the G7. And I have reporting that in recent weeks, ahead of the trial, President Biden made the point, Joe, that you did, saying that if he weren't running for re-election, he believed that Hunter would have gotten that plea deal that fell apart last summer at the last moment, that plea deal which would have kept Hunter Biden out of prison. And now, we shall see, but he could face a lengthy prison time, possibly, depending on what the judge decides. And in terms of the fallout going forward, first and foremost, this is a personal toll on President Biden. We know how close he is to his son. He texts and calls him each and every day. Aides worry about that, both on this overseas trip and as sentencing approaching. As far as the politics, which we'll dive into later, campaign aides, both for Biden and Trump, don't think this will change the trajectory of the race, but they do suspect it will be a flashpoint come their first debate, where Donald Trump may make some very personal, ugly attacks at President Biden. And we should expect President Biden to stay. There's some aides want him to even flash a temper there and say, look, I'm a father. This is my son. This is inappropriate, thinking that could resonate with voters. It would be because it would be a very real human response. And the Biden campaign, as a final point, they are going to continue using nomenclature like convicted felon to describe Donald Trump. They're not going to back away from that because Donald Trump's on the ballot. Hunter Biden is not.
Let's be very clear about this. In the debate, because I've heard a lot of people talking about this concern. Mike Barnicle, if I'm Joe Biden and I'm on the debate stage with Donald Trump and he starts talking about Hunter Biden as some sort of retort against his own 34 felonies, I'd stop, I'd turn, I'd look around the stage and go, excuse me, hold on. I don't see Hunter Biden up here. Hold on, Donald, let me check.
Maybe
I don't see Eric over there. Wait, Eric's not here, so I'm not running against Eric. I'm running against you, Donald, and you're not running against Hunter Biden or the ghost of Hunter Biden, who's not here. You're running against me. And up here, the two people that are going to run this country for the next 4 years, of the two of us, only one has been convicted of a felony. And you've been convicted of 34 felonies, Donald. So let's leave our kids out of this. Let's leave our family out of this. You don't want me to start talking about what you and your kids and your in-laws did in your name to get rich off of your back during the presidency. Boom. That's it.
Saudi Arabia.
Ends it. And you know what? He shouldn't take any crap from Trump, and he needs to be ready. Because Donald Trump has 34 felony convictions. Joe Biden, none. Those are the two people on stage. And he shouldn't. Biden's people should double down right now and go harder at Trump than ever before on the fact he's a convicted felon.
A former Trump White House attorney sounding the alarm on what Donald Trump has planned for his political opponents if he wins the election and returns to the White House for a second term. In an interview with NBC News earlier this week, attorney Ty Cobb, who served in the first Trump administration, warned that the former president's focus on the topic of revenge in interviews following his conviction in the New York criminal hush money case is a big red flag. Cobb said, quote, "I think there should be concern," adding, "From a 30,000-foot view, what I see is Trump angrier now than he was before because he is convicted now."
Well, and that matches reporting from John Lemire and others that Trump is just beyond angry and listening to nobody and is just obsessed on revenge.
In multiple interviews in the recent days after his conviction on 34 felony counts by a jury, Trump has pushed the idea of revenge and retribution in his second term. Take a listen.
People are claiming you want retribution. People are claiming you want what has happened to you done to Democrats. Would you do that ever?
Look, what's happened to me has never happened in this country before. And it has to stop because...
Wait a minute. I want to hear that again. It has to stop.
Well, it does have to stop because we're not going to have a country...
And if you're
anymore.
elected, what does that mean? Define that.
Look, what I've gone through, nobody's ever gone through. I'm a very legitimate person. I built a great business. Based on what they've done, I would have every right to go after them. I have a lot of lawyers that are friends and this and that. I had probably 25 guys over the course of a couple of months say, whatever you do, don't testify, because you'll say something that's a little bit off, and you will be indicted for lying, for perjury. These are evil people. These are sick, evil people.
I think you have so much to do, you don't have time to get even. You only have time to get right.
Well, revenge does take time, I will say that.
It does.
And sometimes revenge can be justified, Phil. I have to be honest. You know, sometimes it can.
Wouldn't it be terrible to throw the president's wife and the former Secretary of State? Think of it, the former Secretary of State, but the president's wife into jail. Wouldn't that be a terrible thing? But they want to do it. So, you know, it's a terrible, terrible path that they're leading us to, and it's very possible that it's going to happen to them.
Let's bring in editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg, and former U.S. attorney and MSNBC contributor Barbara McQuade. She's the author of a book that just becomes more relevant by the day. You look at the Washington Post article yesterday, you look at our reporting on Sinclair today. Attack from Within, How Disinformation is Sabotaging America. Mike Barnicle and Jonathan Lemire, as well as Caddy Kay, are still with us. Jonathan Lemire, I should go to you first just to get a follow-up on, you know, my reporting, and I know yours too, from inside the Trump campaign is he's angrier than ever. He's not listening to anybody when it comes to pushing back on revenge. And we see time and time again Hannity trying to move him to saying he's not going to take revenge. And we didn't show the clip where Trump says, I know you want me to say something nice, but these are, but I have every right to go after them. And then you had Dr. Phil trying to say, you're not going to take revenge, are you? And he said, these are sick, evil people. Revenge would be justified. And then, of course, nobody trying to push back on the Hillary Clinton part where he talks about very possible he's going to seek revenge. Like he's fired up and he's ready to go when it comes to seeking revenge to anybody who's opposed him in the past.
Yeah, and I'm told there's a similar dynamic behind closed doors when he meets with advisors or other Republicans, where he'll talk about revenge, sometimes get a look like, well, do you really mean that? And he makes it clear he does. This is retribution. That's the word that has been the center of this Trump campaign for a year now, and that has only been heightened with his anger about this criminal conviction. And let's be clear, he is blustering about how he would be fine with going to prison if he had to. He'd be a martyr for the cause. He says things very differently in private, per my reporting. He also makes it clear on Truth Social with those all-cap screeds just how concerned he is at the prospect of ever being behind bars. And he and his team are putting together an actual agenda of revenge. This is just going to be his rhetoric, which was sometimes what happened in 2020. Trump would spout something off, but his administration would be unable, or frankly at times unwilling, to follow through. But there are not going to be grown-ups in the room this time. They're not going to be guardrails. No. It is just going to be true believers and loyalists. And if Trump says he wants revenge, if Trump says I want to target a particular person or institution, they're going to do just that.
Well, and Jeff Goldberg here on that list too. Welcome to the club. Donald Trump recently going after The Atlantic for actually reporting the truth and reporting what others have said, as well as his chief of staff, his longest-serving chief of staff, that Trump didn't get sacrifice. And when you reported that he had told people around him that people who went to war and died were losers and suckers, he, of course, got angry. He's still pushing back on you now because of a Biden ad. But again, that was confirmed by his longest-serving chief of staff, wasn't it?
Yeah. John Kelly, former Marine general, who lost his son in Afghanistan, confirmed on the record after my story appeared, that these things happen. But my story was well sourced and not refutable, obviously, and so he keeps bringing this up. To be fair, Biden keeps bringing up because the Biden campaign believes that this is an effective line of attack. I'm not so sure it's an effective line of attack. I think all this knowledge we have about Donald Trump and his character and his personality and his beliefs baked in already to the formula here, starting with his attack on John McCain in 2015. But I'm under the impression that this really gets at Trump because it could soften his support among veterans, among military people, if they come to the belief that he really truly has a lack of respect for them and their service.
Barbara McQuaid, yesterday's verdict in the Hunter Biden trial was not a surprise, really, when you look at the evidence that was presented. It's not a surprise that the jury was only out for 3 hours. But I think to a lot of people it was probably a surprise when they thought about it, which is probably not a whole lot. The average person has problems of their own out there. But the son of the President of the United States was on trial. The jury was made up of his neighbors, basically, in Delaware. The president indicated he would not pardon his own son. And yet the reaction on one side of the political aisle was incredible. Does this worry you at all that we are sleepwalking into a situation where the nuts and bolts of this country are going to come popping apart because of the derangement syndrome on the right?
Yeah, I do worry about it, Mike. All of these calls for retribution, and they're coming not just from Donald Trump. We've heard Steve Bannon. We've heard Stephen Miller. Even John Yoo, who is a former Department of Justice official, now a professor. Of course, he was the author of the famous torture memo, so someone on the extreme right. But one of the things he has written is that it is necessary to go after political rivals, to go after people in the Democratic Party. And the purpose of that is to delegitimize the prosecution of Donald Trump. One of the things he has written is we can't let this conviction of Donald Trump stand in history. And so what we need to do is to charge and prosecute other prominent Democrats so that people will understand this is just one more political weapon. And the danger there, of course, is that when people believe that criminal prosecution is simply a political weapon, it delegitimizes the criminal justice system altogether. That means people are less likely to obey the rule of law. And it also encourages people to take the law into their own hands in the form of vigilante violence.
It's so interesting, Jeffrey. I mean, if there are those who think this is paranoia, or no, he wouldn't go that far. That's crazy. That's not for this country. I think it's important to remind people to look at what he's already done the first time around, whether it's talking about the January 6 rioters who are in prison, saying he wants to pardon them, calling them hostages, or look at actually what he's done. With the help of his Leonard Leo picks for the Supreme Court, Donald Trump takes credit for overturning Roe. And let's think about what that is.
People said would never happen.
People said that would never happen. 50 years of rights, abortion health care, DNCs, anything you need to get health care during a problematic pregnancy or a problem in your pregnancy, you can't get now. Women right now, thanks to Donald Trump, are bleeding out on bathroom floors, in their homes. They're being sterilized. I know this, I would love for this to sound crazy and extreme. It's actually
happening, along with 10-year-old girls getting raped and having to flee states, victims of incest having to flee states.
That's what Trump has already done.
That's what he's already done.
And I hope that people who think this is overkill, oh, he would never have retribution, think about that image of a woman bleeding out instead of getting simple health care because of Donald Trump. He's denied that to them. And I wonder, Jeffrey, why people don't believe their eyes.
Yeah, and their ears. I mean, this is fairly simple in a way. You don't need an intelligence agency to understand what Donald Trump is going to do if he becomes president again. He's telling us every single day. We're getting proof on a daily or weekly basis of a couple of things. The first is that he is focused mainly on retribution. He's focused on not making the mistakes in scare quotes, that he made the first time around, in which he empowered people from the establishment, and they tried to build guardrails. John Kelly was one of them, tried to build guardrails around him. So that's gone. That's finished. He's going to come in loaded for bear. This time he's going to do the Muslim ban right again in scare quotes, so that it actually works and isn't challenged in the same way. That's one thing. The second thing is I listened to the entire Las Vegas rally speech this past weekend. I listened to it mainly because I was mentioned in it, and I wanted to find out the context of this. And I hadn't listened to a full speech in a couple of months. You know, there was a 10-minute segment in there about being whether it's better to be eaten by a shark or be electrocuted by a battery. And I feel like, and this is, I'm going to beat this drum over and over again. I feel like we should, in the media, be covering the, I don't know what word to use for those kind of soliloquies, those kind of unhinged soliloquies. People need to understand that he's not well. Right, and that it's all part of the same package. The desire for revenge, the contempt that he has for everyone, including veterans and soldiers, and these strange flights of stream of consciousness thoughts that if we're coming out of the mouth of Joe Biden, we would be talking about the 25th Amendment. We'd be talking about the possibility of removing him from office. It's you just have to watch and listen and keep your ears open, and you'll see exactly what's coming. Nothing's going to be a surprise, right? Because he's just articulating it over and over and over again.
So, more than 2 months after a container ship struck Baltimore's Francis Scott Key Bridge, causing its collapse and cutting off access to the city's vital port, the 700-foot wide Fort McHenry Federal Channel has reopened. Joining us now, Maryland Governor Wes Moore. He's a member of the Biden-Harris campaign's National Advisory Board, and we'll really appreciate your being on this morning. Talk first about the impact that had on Baltimore's economy and the speed to which the bridge finally has been reopened.
You know, I remember that first morning when we now saw that a ship that was the size of 3 football fields was now trapped inside the Patapsco River with 6 Marylanders who weren't accounted for and with now tens of thousands of tons of steel that was sitting in the middle of the river, mangled. And we knew that one of the main vehicles for economic activity, not just for Baltimore, not just for Maryland, but for the entire region, was now stuck to a halt. And I remember that first morning when people said that this would take multiple months. Our ports director said people were telling him that this could take up to a year to clear the federal channel with the amount of debris that's sitting in the water. And this morning, I have to tell you, I'm really proud of my state. I'm really proud of the coordination that in Maryland we do big things because we do them in partnership. And now, despite being told this would take multiple months, we now have the full federal channel. We're talking 700 feet by a 50-foot depth that is now allowing ships and traffic and commerce to commence in the city of Baltimore, in the state of Maryland, and also looking at how many people were impacted that during this time, because we're able to work in partnership with the Biden administration, partnership with our local leaders, partnership with the private sector, that tens of thousands of workers who were working at the port who that very morning were afraid that they no longer had a job. The over close to 1,000 businesses, small businesses that work with the Port of Baltimore. We are now able to stand up programs to be able to support workers, worker retention programs, businesses who said they would not lay off workers. This has been a case study on how to get things done big, how to get things done fast, and the only way you're going to do that is by working together. So I'm incredibly proud that this morning, despite such a tragedy that we saw a little over 2 months ago, that this morning we can say that Baltimore is back, and it's because we decided to work together in this moment.
Governor, good morning. It's good to see you. I think a lot of people saw this news a couple of days ago and looked at their watches and said, wow, that was fast. A couple of months. It made me think it was 1 year ago, right now, actually, that bridge collapsed in Pennsylvania on I-95, and that was back up and running in 12 days. So for all the complaints, and there are many of them, and many of them are valid about the pace of business inside federal and state governments, how did you get this done, and what lessons can be shared with others?
I think the big thing was that we worked together. You know, I remember my phone rang at 2:02 in the morning that first morning and letting me know that the Key Bridge was now gone. And so immediately we started mobilizing assets, mobilizing the first responders who were on the bridge within minutes, making sure they could stop the flow of traffic. And I have to give them a shout out because they saved countless lives that morning, mobilizing the members of the state police and the divers who within an hour were in the water working to save lives, working with our Department of Transportation who were already coming with rerouting patterns because we knew that people were hours away from waking up and figuring out that the place that they used to be able to get to work, that was now gone. The tens of thousands of port workers who were about to wake up and realize that they did not have a place to go to work, how to make sure that we're supporting the families. And so we laid out, I laid out 4 directives that first morning. One was that we had to support the families and give them comfort and closure, the families of the 6 Marylanders we lost. The second was that we had to support those who've been directly impacted by the crisis, and that included the port workers and the first responders and their families. The third was that we had to do everything in our power to reopen the federal channel as quickly as possible. And the fourth is that we have got to fully rebuild the Francis Scott Key Bridge. And we stayed focused. We did not let anything distract us. We stayed coordinated with both the Biden administration, who've been remarkable, the private sector, who've been tremendous partners throughout, our local leaders. And we know that now that we're coming to the completion of this phase of getting the federal channel reopened, I have the same focus. I have the same diligence on making sure we can accomplish that fourth directive, which is getting the Francis Scott Key Bridge rebuilt.
All right, Maryland Governor Wes Moore, thank you so much for coming on with the update this morning. We appreciate it. Moving on, new polling finds improving views about President Joe Biden's ability to manage the economy. According to the latest numbers from the Financial Times and the University of Michigan, 41% of registered voters trust Donald Trump more to handle the economy compared to 37% who say they trust Biden more. As recently as February, Trump's lead over Biden was 11 points when that same question was asked. Overall, voters ranked the economy as their most important issue by a wide margin, 24 points ahead of the future of Social Security and Medicare. Meanwhile, the Consumer Price Index just crossed, showing no increase in May. Economists had been looking for a slight increase. Let's bring in the co-anchor of CNBC's Squawk Box, Andrew Ross Sorkin. He's also a columnist for the New York Times. Also with us, NBC News senior business correspondent Christine Romans. Christine, what do you make, though, of this sort of two-sided view on the economy? It seems both sides could be right a little bit, but it has to be put in context.
You know, it's just fascinating. You look at these numbers, and I'm sure Andrew agrees, and these are enviable numbers, except for inflation, on just about every measure of the economy. But when I crisscross the country, especially in swing states, people just don't believe it. Even when they tell me that they have record home equity, that they have record amounts in their 401ks, that they are feeling good in their business, they say that the rest of the country isn't feeling it. And so there's this real big disconnect. I think prices and price inflation scars are part of it, but there's also, I think, a gloomy hangover from the COVID years, and people are just really saying they don't feel great about the economy, even as if they look at their own numbers and their own numbers are good.
So, Andrew Ross Sorkin, what's going on with inflation?
Well, we're getting a little bit of whipsawed with some of this data, and I think we're going to find out what Jay Powell at the Fed thinks about it later today. There was an expectation that maybe he wouldn't be lowering interest rates anytime soon in this calendar year ahead of the election because it felt and seemed from the data that inflation was not coming down. Well, today it appears to be coming down a little bit. Appears that the Biden administration, you would think, would be very happy about these numbers because the markets are now suggesting that, in fact, Jay Powell will, at least they're betting that Jay Powell will be lowering interest rates sometime this year, and that's what you're seeing in the equity markets this morning. For the most part, you even also saw inflation come down just a little bit in terms of food, which, of course, has been sort of a bumper sticker for a lot of Americans in terms of how they think about inflation. The sticking point on inflation has still been housing to some degree, and then there's been a sticky issue throughout the year about elderly care at home, which actually on a year-over-year basis is up about 11%. So that's actually that's probably the one sort of bad marker in all of this. But in terms of the good marks, food has come down, and as we said, the inflation piece is a little bit lower than had been anticipated. Again, not out of the woods at all, but most folks, I imagine, if you're sitting in the White House today, are thinking this is a good day.
Christine, let me ask you, we were talking, you and I, during the break, about the gloom that you and your travels, you said, on the air. I've picked this up in my travels and on my radio show. What do you think can happen that would make Americans feel that, yes, we are doing well? Because individuals are saying, I'm doing good, but I think everything is bad. What can happen in this economic area that could kind of break everybody out of the gloom? And the Biden administration certainly needs it for their reelection.
I think two things can happen. All of these retailers, and even this morning we heard Starbucks is going to have a $5 and a $6 bundle. I think that people might start feeling better about prices if they see these widespread deals throughout the economy. There are some prices that are actually falling, and the retailers have gotten the message they can't just keep passing on higher prices to consumers. That might take some time, but people might start feeling better about that. And also just the idea that time heals all wounds. The more time we have between 9.1%, the inflation number that was the worst of inflation, more time that passes, people start to adjust to a higher baseline for prices. Maybe then that can help people feel more confident about all the other things in their life that are going the right way.
Andrew, President Biden just a short time ago went wheels up for Italy. He's en route to the G7. Talk to us a little bit, if you will, about some of the economic pieces of the agenda there. There's a lot of debate, deal not done yet, about Russian assets being seized, being used for Ukraine. There's been some resistance in Europe about that. What do we think is actually going to get accomplished over these couple of days in the seaside town there in Italy?
You know, look, I don't want to, it's not that I don't want to speculate oftentimes as to what we do. I don't think there's going to be an enormous amount of work that's going to advance things in Europe necessarily. I'm not suggesting this is all going to be theater either, but in the grand scheme of things, I think that the truth is this was on the calendar, it was on the docket, it's something he has to do. But the real focus in between all of these meetings is, of course, what he's going to do when he gets back, which, of course, is these debates coming up in well, now 2 weeks. So I think that most of what's going to happen there is not necessarily going to impact us here. And I don't think there's going to be a remarkable shift in terms of what you're seeing out of Europe, to be honest with you.
All right, CNBC's Andrew Ross Sorkin and NBC's Christine Romans, thank you both very much for being on this morning. We appreciate it.
Do you know how it feels to have the President of the United States to target you? The President of the United States is supposed to represent every American, not to target one. But he targeted me, Lady Ruby, a small business owner, a mother, a proud American citizen who stand up to help Fulton County run an election in the middle of the pandemic.
That was Georgia election worker Ruby Freeman in testimony for the House January 6th committee in 2022 about being targeted by former President Donald Trump after his 2020 loss in her state. Nearly 4 years later, Trump and his allies are reportedly taking things even further in Georgia with the help of the state's Republican-controlled legislature. According to Rolling Stone, quote, Trump-loving elements of the Georgia GOP have wielded that advantage in a crusade to convert discredited election conspiracy theories into policies well ahead of Election Day 2024. Those tactics reportedly include new laws to limit mail-in and early voting, pushing out Republican officials who believe in free and fair elections, and plans to challenge Georgia's final result, even if Trump wins, just to prove a point about imaginary fraud in Democratic areas. Joining us now, senior political reporter at Rolling Stone, Aswin Subsang, who broke this story. Aswin, tell us more about what you found in Georgia.
Well, this is a situation where in the state of Georgia for 2024, obviously it's one of just a handful of states that is going to determine the fate of the 2024 presidential election. Now, just to be clear up front, if the current polling holds, it looks like Donald Trump has a good chance of winning Georgia outright. Having said that, he and his allies, including in and out of the state of Georgia, are not willing to leave that up to chance. The way they are viewing Georgia at the moment, in some of the most granular ways that for years they've been trying to make actual policy and electoral processes changes in the state, is to try to solidify in Georgia a electoral philosophy of heads I win, tails you lose. That after all, is one of the defining traits of Trumpism, both with regards to elections and so much else. Many of the sources close to Trump we spoke to for this story, including on the ground in Georgia, who have been working on these initiatives, view Georgia as a quote-unquote laboratory for what they want to do in other states, particularly battleground states, and nationwide. Now, the reason Georgia is unique in this situation is because, unlike, say, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, or even Arizona, the reason it could be so much of a MAGA laboratory in this sense is because they have unified control of so much of the state when it comes to the Republican Party in the legislature, the governor, the lieutenant governor, the election board. The lieutenant governor is someone who is currently under investigation in the state because of his efforts to help overturn the election for Donald Trump in 2020. So what we found in our reporting, and I can get into it a little bit more specifically if you'd like, if there is a very step-by-step process on so many fronts to wage this war. And it sits, and Donald Trump sits atop this sprawling network, regularly receiving briefings on this and doing what he can even to pressure Republicans in the state to oust obscure Republican officials who aren't kowtowing to the cult of Trump and committing to try to help, to speak bluntly, rig an election for him.
Antoine, as you look at this, though, and I'm familiar with Georgia, full disclosure, we have an office in Atlanta of National Action Network. The people were in place, the Republicans, last election. Yet Biden was able to win. We were able to elect the first Jewish U.S. senator, the first black U.S. senator. Is the answer to this planned by Trump that has now become perceived as a swing state, is there must be major mobilization on the Democratic side? What do you find on the Democratic side that could deal with this, since it is a real entrenchment of Republicans from a very small to a very large city level? They control a lot of the state apparatus.
Well, of course, an answer, if you are a Democratic operative or the Biden campaign, to win a state like Georgia right now is to maintain the margins that you did in 2020. According to the latest slate of polling, it doesn't look like that is necessarily going to be the case. And whatever the polling shows now, there's a very good chance that in Georgia and elsewhere, this is going to be fought at the margins. And what the Republican Party and the Trumpist elements and so many others in Georgia are doing right now on the right is to try to hack at the margins as much as they can, whether it comes to purging voter rolls or trying to MAGAfy the state election board and try to give it powers that it is not necessarily constitutionally allowed to have.
Drop box voting and all.
Right, and really put the screws to mail-in voting and things like that.